I first went to China a very long time ago, I realized that the war, the Japanese invasion, the occupation had had an enormous impact on China, and that much of what happened in the communist period afterwards stemmed from just the horrors and the disruption of the war. It took me a long while to work out how to do it and to realize that what I really wanted to do was the impact on people, not the battles, although they matter, not the economic destruction, which mattered enormously, but the terrible disruption to people's lives, obviously the deaths, but also just the separations, the fact that people said goodbye to their family in 1937 and in many cases never saw them again, because this war, the anti-Japanese war, was followed by the Civil War, the communist takeover, and it was a complete breach, a complete breakdown almost in Chinese society. Not something that was part of the process of modernization or the ways that it's sometimes looked at, but just the total disruption of war. And somehow that's been ignored. And normally you do Chinese history, you stop in 1937 when the Japanese invaded, and you start again in 1949 when the communists took over. To me, almost everything that helped the communists to power took place during the war. To me, the tragedy of this war is that the suffering was universal in one way or another, sometimes much more acute than others. But I think in terms of separation, I remember meeting a wonderful old general in Taiwan who had gone to school in 1937. And when he started to tell me how it was that he'd never, ever seen any members of his family again, of his birth family, it was because of the war and then the Civil War. And he was almost weeping, the sense of loss from being a 15-year-old boy, saying goodbye to your parents to go off to school, and being probably, he was by that time nearly 80, an 80-year-old man who'd never seen any of his relatives before. The deaths and the kind of, just the loss of relatives, again, so common. I remember another colleague of mine saying, so talking about people who died, they weren't killed by the war, but they died as a result, and he said to me, including my mother, who was a refugee in the countryside, had quite an ordinary illness, couldn't get any doctor, died, and he was 3 years old at the time. So I try not to go too much into some of these things because the stoicism, the way people endured, was also very moving and very, very powerful. But it was just a sense again and again of how unbelievably sad this period was for China. I said, I really would love to have something by Robert Capa, who is the greatest of all war photographers, but as the greatest of all war photographers, also, as you can imagine, quite, his pictures don't come for nothing, so to speak, so they agreed. And he went to China in 1938 as a very young man, and this is taken in North China, Taizhuang, where they were, it was a huge battle against the Japanese forces, which the Chinese won. So it's a very any Chinese looking at that cover and seeing where it was will know that was our victory. He then went on to photograph extensively in the Second World War and took many of the most famous photographs of the liberation of France and of the D-Day landings and whatnot. And not that long afterwards, was actually killed in Vietnam. So it was a brief and absolutely glorious career of photography. And for me I think more than anybody else, captured the sense of the war. This photograph was taken after, you've probably seen the very famous one of the Spanish soldier falling backwards in death, which is his most famous photograph. The suffering in China wasn't unique at all, and I think I mentioned early on it was on the same kind of level as the Soviet Union. It would compare in terms of the population at large with the American Civil War and also with the casualties that France suffered in the First World War. I actually mention all of those because those turned out to be long, long-lasting scars. Every time you mention Japan and China, you get the same reactions. It hasn't died down at all. I think that what I found, and this is one of my most important conclusions to me, is that the scale of suffering and the kind of almost numbness that came over people and the desire to survive as individuals or as very small groups at all costs, to me explains a great deal of what happened later on in China itself, in the Cultural Revolution.